Thank you. Good morning and welcome, everyone. As was said, my name is Gbemi Otudeko. I'm a second-year Wharton MBA student. I'm also the co-president of the Wharton Africa Student Association. Again, we're delighted to have you all here with us, and we thank you for being here. To help us frame, or to help us with our discussion this morning, are two of our very esteemed guests who I will introduce and ask to come up to the stage. First, Mr. Uyi Akpata is the PwC Regional Senior Partner for West Africa and the Country Senior Partner for Nigeria. In the last 15 years at PwC, he has engaged with global clients such as ExxonMobil and Chevron, and in 2012, he was appointed Africa Oil and Gas Industry Leader and was the head of the Energy Industry Group. He graduated from the University of Lagos with a degree in accounting and later qualified as a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria, where he is a current fellow. He is a formidable authority in the energy industry in West Africa and Africa as a whole. So please join me in welcoming up to the stage Mr. Uyi Akpata. Thank you. Ambassador John Simon is the founding partner at Total Impact Advisors, an advisory practice that specializes in sourcing and developing global investment opportunities that are socially and financially attractive. He was nominated by President Bush as the United States Ambassador to the African Union and also served as the Executive Vice President of OPIC. Ambassador Simon received his bachelor's degree from Princeton University and a master's in public policy from Harvard University. He is truly a champion for social impact investments in Africa. So Ambassador John Simon, thank you. Thank you. Thank you both for joining us. I'll be moderating the discussion this morning, and we will take a top-down approach to our discussion and start with broad themes before narrowing down to specifics, and leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. One of my favorite professors always maintains that the very best questions can be asked in between 8 to 10 words. And he always says that. So we kindly ask that as the discussion's progressing, you start to think about how you frame the delivery of your question so that we can get through as many questions in the end. Thank you very much. Let's get started. And why don't we start with a broad stroke and get a summary of both your perspectives on Africa's growth to date and where you think Africa is at now in its growth trajectory. We're calling it an inflection point. How would you both best characterize where Africa is now? And we can start with you, Ambassador.
Sure. Well, if you think about an inflection point for the continent, really the inflection point, the inflection point or an inflection point occurred about 15 years ago, or about 12 to 15 years ago, when you saw a real decrease in the amount of civil violence on the continent. You saw a real increase in the number of countries that had democratic regimes and democratic governance, and you saw a real improvement in the economic management of many economies on the continent. And again, whenever we talk about Africa, we have to recognize that today Africa is 54 countries. It used to be 53. Obviously, within that, there's a tremendous amount of diversity. There's a tremendous amount of diversity within each country or within many of those countries. But as a general rule, the about 15 years ago, there was a real inflection point in terms of the level of civil strife on the continent, the quality of political governance, and the quality of economic governance. And I think the results are seen in the overall economic statistics. I mean, you saw a continent that grew at less than 2 or 3% for decades suddenly achieve 5 or 6% growth across the continent. I think 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa. and Africa outperformed as a region in terms of just pure economic growth most of the regions of the world. And that carried through when you saw the financial crisis. So among all the regions of the world, Africa suffered the least during the financial crisis. There was actually an article written by one of my colleagues at the Center for Global Development, Africa's Capitalist Revolution, that talked about how while many other countries adopted what would be thought of as unorthodox, poor economic policies, many other regions during the crisis, African countries by and large hewed to a relatively orthodox Washington consensus approach, and it served them fairly well. However, I think what we've seen recently is a bit of a plateau. I think the benefits from doing the basics, getting the basics right, bringing down inflation, bringing down fiscal deficits, putting in place basic commercial rule of law. Those benefits are at some level, it's not that they're over, but their ability to provide added economic growth potential has reached a limit. And now what you really need to see, and I think the folks who opened this conference highlighted that, you really need to see the development of a new value-added model for Africa to achieve the type of the next inflection point. And that inflection point that won't just result in above average economic growth, but really result in the broad prosperity that's necessary to really satisfy the hundreds of millions of Africans who really have not realized in their own pocketbooks, in their own pockets, all the benefits that have accrued to the continent in the last decade and a half or so.
Sure.
Thank you. But before I go straight to that your question, I think it's very important for me to thank the organizers for bringing me to Wharton. I've been wanting to do this for 15 years, hoping to do some kind of business degree in one form or the other, and Wharton was always my first choice. So at the end of the day, when I saw this opportunity, I believed it was some way of probably getting an honorary degree. Hopefully, we can talk about that after this. So basically, I've had 30 years on the streets, as it were, my career in PwC. So some of my points as I see Africa has been based on my interactions with government and the public and private sector as we work along. But let's look at it back to what the ambassador said. About 20 years ago, I had a tour of duty in Liberia. This was before the Liberian War. And then there was focus on Africa. Remember the normal BBC program, Focus on Africa? And it was all about wars, famine, diseases, and the rest of it. But now, we've gone straight out to a situation where Africa has different outlook. We have a situation where, as you said, 6 of the 10 largest economies in the world are in Africa, witness growth rates of up to 7% per annum. And where I see as a reflection point is now, really. Now we need to take it to the next level. This growth has mainly been driven by the service sector and the growth has really been driven by the service sector and the application of the natural resources, but outflow not being retained in the Africa economy. So now we want to see real inclusive growth at the time it's now. Hopefully we are building on a base of proper governance amongst the African countries. I mean, I say that with a pinch of salt because two weeks ago we know what happened in Burkina Faso. But at the end of the day, that's not widespread. The widespread belief is that there's proper governance structure and the governments in place are now well positioned to have real growth that will be beneficial to the individuals of their various countries.
Thank you. I think, so it's good to start with a bit of reflection on what's happened in the past, and as you've just laid out the evidence and characterized the present, there's lessons to be learned from growth models from other successful emerging market economies, who have applied, as Ifedayo and Tayo mentioned, low-cost manufacturing in Asia, for example. How do African countries go about deriving the best model for their onward growth? And in your mind, are there any systematic things or tools that governments and private sector need to put in place in order to come up with the winning formula for Africa, if there is one?
What I'll say here, first, there's no one fixed solution for all of Africa. As I said, we are 54 countries, but having said that, I think there's alignment in the general direction that the African countries should be going. In my view, what is happening where people are really winning, especially if you look at countries like Rwanda, is a situation where you have government and private sector actually now cooperating and collaborating and going into real sectors. For instance, in Rwanda, we have a situation where technology has been the main driver. Technology, very, very key. But as I said, it's very important for us to understand that the platform has to be firmly established. CEOs are telling us that government and governance have to provide the right platform. And in places that have been really successful, like Rwanda, as I said, going back to Rwanda, you have a situation where the corruption rate, based on our CEO survey, is actually, most of the CEO says government operating in corrupt environment is less than what we have in most developed countries. And a situation where we have the platform, cost of doing business for government is better than what we have in most countries. Rwanda has set that example. Then at the end of the day, the government and governance is to create the right infrastructure so that the private sector can partner for us to get to that next level. So first is that partnership. Then let's concentrate on the real sector. I have an oil and gas background, industry background. So I'll give a typical example of participation when it comes to the oil and gas space. Oil and gas used to be primarily government and the international IOCs, but in Nigeria specifically. But in the last 10 years, we have a number of independents coming into that space. Local content has driven that. So we have despite the security challenges in the Niger Delta and other areas, we have a situation where that has led to tremendous growth with more participation in that sector. I guess I wouldn't go too much into details unless we are discussing specifically about that sector. But at the end of the day, government, private sector partnership is crucial as we move to the next level and concentrating on the real sector. Agriculture, for one, is a no-brainer. We need to tap that.
Yeah, I agree with everything Uye said, but I would emphasize a few points. And actually, I think it's important to note, you raised two issues that I think should be separated. One is what governments should do, and the other is what is the next African growth model. And I think at the outset, the next African growth model is not going to be driven by governments. It'll be driven by the private sector. And I think there are a few examples of that. What governments need to do is make sure they create the environment that's going to allow that next model to come forward. As I noted before, they've already done the basic stuff. They've already established what I think is relatively, and this is again, this varies from country to country and varies from year to year, but basically they've established a basic framework for sound economic governance across the continent, which is positive. I think the next big step they have to do is invest in infrastructure and health and welfare in their countries. And that's a huge challenge because the old model for infrastructure investment, have it run by a government-run parastatal with a big loan from the World Bank. That's just not going to meet the needs that are there. And so you have to develop these public-private sector models, which, as you know only too well, are not easy. They require a lot of work by lawyers, a lot of work by accountants, a lot of work by hopefully some Wharton grads who are going to go to Africa and try and make these things happen. But ultimately, I think the focus of government needs to be on putting in place those infrastructure elements, power, water, health, and education, that are fundamental for any economy anywhere in the world to grow. But what's going to make African growth special, I think, is what's going to come out of the private sector. And some of the models that have been a function of the unique situation that exists in Africa. And part of the unique situation that exists in Africa is you have entrepreneurs who've had to adapt, who've had to use different technologies and different modes of doing business. You've had very fragmented supply chains, and you've had people who've had to figure out how you pull those things together. And I think within that, there's real opportunity. I mean, the classic example is M-Pesa in Kenya. I mean, where is the world's best mobile payment system? I mean, we have this new Apple Pay here. I don't know how many people use it. I don't know, companies are saying they're not going to be part of it. And yet, in Kenya, the most advanced mobile payment system in the world is there. And that type of technology is being applied to something like energy, with something like M-Kopa. It can be applied to education, where you can use mobile phones to be able to provide sort of Socratic learning with question and answers that people can answer on their phones and reach people who can't necessarily get to school. And I think it's using these types of models, and it's not all about technology. I think if you take agriculture, which I think is the great opportunity, the opportunity to provide higher quality inputs to the farmers at the farmer level through distributors that are able to grow better quality plants. We work with a company in Rwanda that provides seed plants for farmers that can produce 10 times what the farmers are getting today. So if you take a look at Rwanda, a third of the crops that are planted are bananas. Those bananas yield about 5 tons a hectare. In Costa Rica, bananas yield about 80 tons a hectare. Now, if you can provide the same type of plants, but find a way to get it to that local farmer instead of creating these massive plantations, which if you look at Rwanda, that's just not going to happen. The upside is tremendous. And so I think the next African growth model is going to take a look at what's happening on the ground and figure out how you build on that and not take models from other regions and try and impose them top down on the continent.
Sure, thank you. And you touched on a few things, so saying the necessity for the private sector to first lead the way and then the government to have a supporting environment for that. Africa is a makeup of 54 countries, like you said. Do you see any opportunities for regional or country-to-country partnerships where governments can partner together to ensure that there's growth as a whole? Or do you think we'll continue to see a model where countries are defined by their specific country's strengths and fundamentals?
Unfortunately, we have a situation where the respective governments believe that their primary constituents remains in country. And it's like we have 1,001 things to achieve, as we say in Nigeria, to yield the dividend of democracy. So clearly there will still be focus in country. But the reality is to take advantage of economies of scale, regionalization is very, very important. Political platforms have been established like the ECOWAS in West Africa, the Southern Africa and East Africa, but actually working as a team is crucial if we are to set the platform for the next stage of growth for Africa. So those regional blocks need to come together. I'm aware of the fact that in West Africa, for instance, the current president of ECOWAS, who is the Ghanaian president, driving a lot of initiatives so that we can have regional cooperation, especially when it comes to issues related to infrastructure development. Power across Africa is very key. That's going to set the platform for sustainable growth in many areas. That is really, and we talk about issues like, for instance, it took me 17 hours to get here from Lagos yesterday, but it probably would have been longer if I wanted to go to the DRC, which a straight flight would have been 2.5 hours. And DRC, that's the center, I mean, we're expecting the largest hydro dam to serve most of Africa from the DRC. So those logistics and rest is important for us to have regional trades as we go forward. Unfortunately, as I said, there's a lot to do. The reason why most of these governments have come into governance, as it were, is for their immediate constituents. So there's a lot to do on that stage, but ultimately, for us to go regional is key if Africa is really going to be seen as a major player in like the next decade.
Yeah. Once again, I can't agree more. In fact, I'd emphasize that. I think Africa cannot achieve its potential if it doesn't find a way to create regional economic blocks and ultimately a continent-wide economic bloc which obviously we've seen the value of that in some place like the European Union. The only way I see that happening is if the leading nations in the various regions step up and start to think of themselves as leaders of the region instead of only leaders of their country. And so in Southern Africa, that would be South Africa. In West Africa, that would be Nigeria. In East Africa, that would be Kenya. But it's only if those countries begin to act as in the interest of the region as a whole and recognize that as the biggest countries in those regions, they benefit when those regions prosper. And then as the biggest countries in the continent, they benefit when the continent prospers. That's the only way it happens. If those countries instead continue to act, well, we really only need to serve the interests of our own country, it doesn't, and we're going to focus only on that narrow interest in our relations within the region, then I don't think it happens. And I think this is one of the critical prerequisites for the type of inflection point that you've talked about.
Sure, thank you. So let's stay more in the positive, or have a bit more leave the optimism and perhaps move into a more hypothetical situation where, if we assume that we live in a utopian system where all things are possible, or perhaps I want you to envision what you think the best case scenario for Africa is. So what is Africa? What does it look like at its best? And you envision that. Does that model look more like the West or the developed countries, or does it exist in its own unique state that hasn't been seen before?
Wow. Give me a second to dream. Clearly, I would like to take that from the context of what we see as the major mega trends. Consider a situation where urbanization will lead to a situation where by 2050, 50% of Africa will be in cities. So urbanization is going to drive a lot of infrastructure development, technology in play, us exploiting our natural resources, where 60% of the arable land in the world is in Africa. Well, we still have 60% arable undeveloped land against the backdrop of climate change and threats in food scarcity. So I see a situation where there will be real focus on Africa, as it were. A situation where there will be regional trade and free movement of people from one country to another. That's very, very important because today we have a situation where we have difficulties getting human resource to work across the PwC network within Africa. So you have a case where even within Africa, you have to get work permits. And so I see where that 54 African countries will truly be seen as one Africa, or at least the regional blocks be seen to be working together. And it's only by that collective type of interaction you have the platform where Africa is seen as a real world player in that Africa space, as it were. I think the short time I had was restricted to the economic situation of Africa. The other dreams relate to the entertainment and information and the other bits about how I see Africa as being the destination for real relaxation in the next 50 years.
I mean, first and foremost, from my perspective, and it's interesting the point you made about entertainment at the end, because that's actually where I see the greatest potential. But to get there, first and foremost, there has to be complete intolerance of the political violence that still crops up across the continent. And you have to have a situation where Africa's at peace, and where those who seek to disturb the peace are addressed and dealt with very quickly. And as to the regional organizations and the continental organizations that can make that happen. Secondly, like I said, you have to have the ability for free movement of goods and talent and people across borders. so that all those talents can be, you get the economies of scale of all those talents being come together and being able to be as productive as possible. You definitely are going to have, in the ideal world, a continent that has the infrastructure necessary for the fastest urbanizing place in the world. And you have cities that actually work, where you're not stuck in traffic all day, where you can get from place to place, where you have competent governance and you don't worry about crime or pollution and the ability to get clean water or breathe clean air. And so all those things, I think, are in the ideal world, are critical foundation. But what is built on that foundation, in my mind, is the leveraging of the greatest asset that Africa has, which is its cultural diversity. So if you think about Africa, Africa is an extraordinarily rich continent. It's rich in minerals. It's rich in agricultural land. It's rich in human resource and talent. But it's incredibly rich in art and culture and imagination, if you will. And if you think about what, in our world today, where the greatest returns are, greatest returns are not to commodity production. The greatest returns are not to manufacturing. The greatest returns aren't even to sort of value-added manufacturing. The greatest returns are to content, to imagination, to the ability to create new concepts and ideas and thoughts. And that's where I think the strength, because of its rich history and because of its rich cultural diversity, that's where I think the strength of the continent lies in the utopian future, if you will. And it's creating the foundation for that to blossom that really is the opportunity.
Thank you very much. We're going to be rounding up. Before I open up to the audience, I think it's appropriate to close with some personal reflection. So maybe you just want to talk very briefly about something tangible and something actionable. You know, it could be in your jobs and in your roles in your day-to-day that you can visibly contribute to helping the African cause, as it were. And this is hopefully to help advise all the attendees or the audience how they can also start to think about and frame how they can be a part of the growth model and helping it achieve its potential.
Is that no longer
working? Hello? Is this?
Now I think you're working. Now I think
you're
okay,
this. I think the very first is when are you completing your respective programs and coming back to Africa? I say that on a serious note because across Africa, I think the biggest challenge now is having the right skills. 80% of the CEOs surveyed during the recent PwC Africa survey shows that we are having significant gaps when it comes to, we're having that we have significant gaps when it comes to human resource. 15 years ago, I had discussions with the then managing director of ExxonMobil Nigeria, and the talk at that time was getting expatriate resource into Nigeria to do work because it was considered quite expensive. Now there's a total turnaround. It's more expensive to get a local expat African in any of the international oil companies, or for that matter, any of the major international oil companies or any multinational operating in Africa. So there's that scarcity of resource, and the more we have people going back to help, that will be very, very important. And second area is on governance. I say that from the private sector point of view. Remember, we are working on a platform of public and private partnership. From a government point of view, governance is still very, very key. Since taking over as the country senior partner for PwC 3 months ago, we've sort of rolled out a program where we're going to support governments when it comes to governance. And governance not only at the national level, or state levels, but local government levels. I mean, if governance is improved significantly, government knows its role that it's expected to play, then at the end of the day, we'll have a situation where the average 6 to 7% growth, which is currently being based on our resources that have been exploited and mainly service related revenues, will just grow in leaps and bounds when we're talking about more sustainable areas like agriculture and infrastructure and the rest of it. So let's get back to support the Africa initiative, as it were, recognizing that governments cannot be no longer where we are today. Rather, we will only improve. It's very interesting to see that the events that happened in Burkina Faso 2 weeks ago, if it was 10 years ago, the regional governments would have just folded their arms and see what would have happened. But within a couple of days, the West African heads of states went to the military in Burkina Faso, requesting that they immediately hand over to a civilian administration because those reckless behaviors is not sustainable in the Africa of the future.
In my work at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation and my work today with African companies, the greatest deficit is talent. And like I say, it's not because there's not talent on the continent, but there are not a lot of folks who've been to Wharton who necessarily go and take up the positions that are required around in the businesses that are there. And so I think to the extent there are people in this room who want to be part of the opportunity in Africa, there's an open door. There's a tremendous number of opportunities and if people want to know them, feel free to talk to me afterwards because we have a number of companies that can use very talented people to help make a difference in the private sector, helping to develop the African companies and enterprises of the future. But the other point I make, I talk to a lot of young Africans who are very successful in the private sector. And I often ask, have you ever thought about public service? And of course, the old model of an ambitious young African was to go into work in government. And to some extent, they've given that model's that old style has given public service something of a bad name. But I think as we're saying, you need talent in the public sector as well. And I think while I heartily support more and more Africans seeking to work in the private sector and to make their careers there initially, I think there also needs to be a recognition that that leadership is required in the public sector, and that it takes a lot of courage to go into the public sector, and that that is an area where Africans who want to make a difference can really apply their talents as well.
Thank you. So we'll take a few questions from the audience, and I just ask if you could form an orderly line just behind the mic and fire away with your questions directed at one of our speakers, please. And I have a few questions as well to help guide the question, but I hope there are questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you very much for coming to the conference today and speaking with us. My name is Wanjiko Ngare, and I currently work in renewable energy finance. So a lot of my thoughts center around distributed generation. And in the African context, my question is, a lot of people talk about Africa leapfrogging the giant interconnected grid and African countries being able to go straight to a model that has a lot of involvement of microgrids and distributed generation. Do you see that as an actual real thing that can happen, or is it a pipe dream that us renewable energy folks like to think about? Thank you.
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, there was a question that was asked about regional cooperation. In ideal situations, I mean, regional governments coming together and recognizing the importance of the DRC potentials would be the ideal situation to go. But it comes down to the same situation we're talking about, where in the state of play in Nigeria, for instance, where we have significant gap when it comes to power, the government of the day believing that I can do it or go it alone. But the deficit is so large that ultimately I see synergy or alignment. The regional initiative working hand in hand local initiatives. So as we continue to have regional groups driving that initiative, hopefully sustainable, on a sustainable long-term basis, that's the way. I agree with you. It's not a pipe dream, but that's the way we should go in the long term.
Yeah. Microgrids, in my mind, are clearly part of the solution, but they can't be the whole solution. And the power deficit is so great, you have to advance on it across a number of fronts. I mean, one thing is because it takes so long to put in place large-scale grid power, microgrids seem to be the piece that seems to advance much quicker, and therefore people put a lot of emphasis on that. I think that emphasis is well placed to some extent, but you can't forget that ultimately microgrids alone are not going to bridge the gap. You have to also have large-scale grid power.
Hello, thank you. My name is Foster Che. I'm in agriculture. I know you guys spoke of infrastructure and a lot of movement of goods across Africa as a whole. My question, I'd like to get your thoughts on a single currency, on the African bloc that can be used to finance all of these infrastructures that are needed to get where Africa needs to get. And I'd like to see your thoughts on that.
It's actually a project that the African Union has been trying to push for a long, long time. It is a big, big challenge, and of course, as we've learned from the European Union, it's something you need to be very careful taking on, because if you take it on with the wrong conditions in place, it can be very damaging. I mean, you know, it's sort of one of those things that I think should not be forgotten. It should be always something that people are thinking about striving towards, but it is a decades-long process, and I wouldn't put it as you know, when I think about all the different things that can happen to improve the opportunities at the macro level in Africa, that would not be on my, you know, top 3 things. It might be on my top 5 or top 10, but it's something that should be there. It certainly would make doing business in Africa much easier, but it's a huge, huge challenge.
I'm inclined to agree with you, Bob. I mean, at the end of the day, the focus for most African countries now is just getting infrastructure in place. I mean, in Nigeria, for example, the Minister of Finance a couple of days ago said we will need $4 billion every year if we are to meet our gap in the next 10 years. So the platform of the US dollar, like generally acceptable, is what we should go with for now. As the ambassador has said, I think in a long-term basis, I don't see us going into the same kind of common currency like you have like in the euro.
But if we're using the US dollar and we're taking loans, a lot of loans from all these, you know, IMFs, World Banks, against a lot of high interest rates, and why don't we just focus on also creating that? I mean, like you said, I know the ECA, because you were in Ethiopia for a while. The ECA has been talking about this. The AU has been talking about this currency issue for a while. Yeah. So why don't we also try to focus on bringing that aspect? Do you not think is a necessity at this stage?
No, I don't think it's a necessity at this stage. I think it's a thing that could be very valuable in the long term, but I think a common currency is a very huge challenge. I mean, it requires, as we've learned from the EU, consolidated fiscal management. It requires broad capital markets. It requires relatively consolidated banking regulation. All those things need to happen first, and all those things are going to take a long, long period of time. But you did mention something else, which is a real challenge, and also a huge opportunity. So the original sin of emerging market finance is to finance assets that have local currency revenues in foreign currency. Almost every major emerging market crisis was a result of this mismatch. In Africa today, I believe, and I mean, I know, for instance, in Ghana, there's $1.5 billion in the pension fund. In Rwanda, there's about $400 million in the pension fund. I think if you add it up, there are billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars in pension funds in Africa, which in local currency, which have local currency obligations. They need to pay the pensioners in local currency. That could be used to finance this infrastructure if they could issue local currency bonds. And so there is a company that we know of that is trying to create a guarantee vehicle that can guarantee those local currency bonds, so the pension funds could buy them. Then they help use their resources to invest in their local country. They help the development, and they have a high quality asset that can help service their liabilities in the long term.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Perpetual. I work with the Institute for Educational Leadership. I wanted to raise a point you mentioned about how the greatest returns in Africa would be seen by an investment in cultural diversity. And I was wondering if you could define or describe that a little bit more, because I think when there's a lot of talk around, Africa's potential for growth or advancement, dialogue tends to be centered on the political institutions or the economic institutions, but not necessarily the cultural institutions. So my question to you, and you as well, is how do we sort of embrace cultural diversity and try to foster that richness in Africa's histories and cultures, while at the same time not being at odds with the whole tradition versus modernity conflict as well in Africa? Because I think that at times when you think about developing Africa economically and politically, people tend to want to develop or modernize Africa culturally as well. So how do we sort of grapple with that?
I mean, I think there are a lot of issues there. I think the first step is recognizing the value of cultural assets, and the ability for those assets to drive the development of some of the highest valued products, commodities that we have in this world, which is content, which is content for entertainment, which is content for communication, that's where the very large returns are. And to the extent you can mine, and that's probably an inappropriate metaphor, but harvest or mine the cultural diversity that exists and the heritage to create content for the modern world. I don't see a conflict between modernity and yet finding within African cultures and the rich panoply that's there valuable inspirations for music, for entertainment, for video, for all sorts of cultural assets that I believe can generate tremendous returns. I think that the mistake is to assume that that A, these assets have no value, and B, the right way to develop is to adopt all of the culture from other places and impose that on Africa. I think when you recognize the asset that's there, you create the possibility to prosper from it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, it's not something I've given considerable thought, but obviously that's our area of strength, and they'll tell you if you build on your strengths, I mean, there's no way you cannot be successful. I think, but the real issue here is that everyone, again, appears to be focused on the hard issues like infrastructural gap, the need for growth in the real sector, but this is one area where we see real strength. Again, coming back to the issue of regionalization and coming together as one, then we can tap into our collective diversity to put ourselves in a platform of sustainable growth in that area, as it were. That's all I can add.
Okay, thank you so much.
How are you doing? My name is Yemi. I'm a second year at Wharton. I believe that as countries develop, it's very key to develop a effective and transparent tax system in order for governments to develop revenue. How serious are African countries about developing a transparent and effective corporate and individual tax system to take advantage of the domestic growth that's going on in those countries?
Well, you're the accountant, so
Good you said I'm the accountant, not the tax practitioner. It's very easy to get one of my tax colleagues there to answer specifically, because it's clear that one of the challenges in Africa, based on our CEO surveys, that we believe, private companies believe that there's over-regulation and not some kind of consistency. I go back to my own country, Nigeria, where it's taking almost like about 4 or 5 years to come up with the petroleum industry bill. And that's not seen the light of day. I mean, it's not likely to take place even up to May. So what you have is a situation where there's hardly any investment in deep water blocks. IOCs and the others are just holding on, so we can't replenish our reserves, as it were. So it's not only a case of being transparent, it's more like recognizing that the governments today are challenged in terms of believing that taking aggressive regulatory positions to get income. All the issues we talk about, infrastructural development is important. But at the end of the day, when both parties recognize that we are in it for the long play, then we have a situation where clearly defined regulations, particularly when it comes to tax, is clearly set for everybody. And at the end of the day, it's consistency that we're talking about here and interpretation of the tax laws. Most governments have gone a long way in helping. I talked about Rwanda, where there's ease of doing business, where countries like Nigeria and some of those operating in West Africa can be more consistent. I think then it will encourage private sector to do work. Obviously, you can refer to the PwC Africa Tax Guide for more details.
I would say it's a credit to, this is sort of one indication of Africa's progress that's taken this long before the subject of aid has come up, which I think is very positive. But one challenge with getting rational tax systems in place is the prevalence that aid has played in buttressing the fiscal, the finances of so many African countries. And so with that aid crutch, it's very difficult to then, and in other countries like Nigeria, the resource crutch, whether it's resource or aid, it's very difficult to think about how you utilize your domestic resources and how you tap into those. I think part of what has to happen is there has to be a recognition that that crutch needs to be thrown away, and we have to think about how we create systems that allow for broad-based, modest, pro-growth tax in Africa. And if we do that, maybe we'll get that in America too one day. But I think that's part of the challenge.
Thank you.
Hello, good morning. My name is Tola Sumano. I work in the agricultural sector. Towards the end of your respective speeches, per se, you both talked about urging young people in the diaspora to move back to Africa. And as someone who's done that, I understand that there are challenges. And so I was just wondering, based on your experiences and your experiences working with young people in the diaspora, if you could give us some practical advice on how to maneuver some of the nuances and the challenges that come from moving back.
Well, I want to assume that most of us are coming from, Africa. It's just a matter of going back. But at the end of the day, I think the climate is right. There's a lot of encouragement for people to come back to Africa, whether as private companies coming to request for talents, and those even public sectors driven by certain initiatives. I think there's more stable environment now for people to actually come back to Africa. Where the challenge will still come, as I mentioned, is where you are not going back to your own country, because here, we just assume going back to Africa. But if I have a Kenyan coming to Nigeria, there's still going to be quite a bit of challenge. And that once we have those ease of doing business to encourage, that way it's going to be easier to close the talent gap that we're talking about. But at the end of the day, I think it's easier now than about 15, 20 years ago across Africa. All I expect us to do is do due diligence and get the right contracting. But you said something, you have an agricultural background.
Yes.
I hear that's arguably, from my experience, that's arguably going to be one of the most exciting places to go back, sectors to go back to. When it comes to Africa, governments are willing to get people from that space as we move forward. Almost every African government is thinking about agricultural growth. 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had a nephew who has been wanting to go and study law and accounting, and I was trying to convince him, go and study agriculture. I was wondering, hey, you read accounting now, you want me to go? You want me to go study agriculture? But I mean, that's the reality, based on mega trends. And 5 years down the line, that's the way to go, that where you have
real contributions to growth.
When he does, we have a company that could use a good agriculturalist with a good finance head. So tell him to give me a call. You mentioned that you face challenges, that you've made the move and you're facing challenges. Can you tell us a little bit what those challenges are?
Sure. So I left Nigeria when I was 10, and I moved back to Nigeria 2 years ago to work in the agricultural sector. And for me personally, it was a very fulfilling experience, but I did recognize that there are a lot of challenges, right? I mean, you're working in an environment where there's kind of utter chaos on a daily basis. Some people thrive on that chaos, some people do not. I had friends who were working in public sector, and one of their concerns was personal brand. Personal brand, because there are a lot of conceptions about working in the Nigerian government. And so a lot of them were worried about the ability to be able to transition from working in Ministry of X in Nigeria to getting a job at a bank in New York, you know? I mean, there's just, corruption is a large term, but it does creep into daily work, and it makes for a lot of inefficiencies. A lot of my work was dealing with the policymakers, and that became a very long and tedious process when it probably shouldn't have been. And there's just natural challenges of living in Lagos. I mean, there's traffic, like the lights go out. I mean, this is like the regular challenges that I think we're all pretty familiar with. But I think everything aggregated can become fairly stressful if you're not particularly thrilled or enthralled with what you're doing professionally.
Well, that last point I think is the most important.
Yeah.
No one can, every sort of path chosen has its obstacles, and you're only able to overcome them if you really are excited about what you get up in the morning every day to do.
Yeah.
And it's, that's the most important thing, is to find something. I mean, my own view is in Africa, there are lots of opportunities for that, but you have to find that. I do think, though, another point you made that is a true one. I mean, you face these pressures to conform to the way things are done. And that's, I think, true everywhere, but I think it's probably more true in certain situations in Africa. And it's amazing how tough it is to make that decision that, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stand up, and I know there's a big personal cost that can be paid, but it's worth doing, because I don't want to do things the way that things used to be done. I want to do things, for lack of a better word, with integrity, the right way. And that's not an easy thing for anyone to do, but the number of people I've known who face a decision and have been able to do that have found it very rewarding. Maybe not in the short term, but in the long term. And that is absolutely a challenge that I think every business person faces, everywhere. It's just, I think, to a greater degree in Africa, where sometimes those pressures can be much greater than they are in, say, South Philly or New York.
Yeah, just very quickly, I mean, I just, again, going back to this point and the issue of governance. Agriculture in Nigeria is where we've seen some telling difference with the new agricultural minister in Nigeria under the agricultural transformation agenda. So I'm almost tempted to say someone who is coming to work in that sector compared to about 5 years ago will see the real benefits of doing that. Private sector, giant, major private companies are going into agri-type business. And then, so this is just back to the same point about government providing the right platform. And everything sort of goes, drills down. Once the tone at the top is right, then obviously things will just improve. So I'm not just, I don't have just a quick fix to say, come, everything will be okay.
Sure.
But just have a change of mindset. What you think is some kind of stumbling blocks, just take it like take it like some exciting ride.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Olu Ajala. I'm second-year student at Tepper School of Business, and I'm interested in energy. In Nigeria today, we generate a little over 4,000 megawatts of a population of about over 170 million people. And in the next 10 years, the goal is to increase that by tenfold. But the biggest challenge that entrepreneurs face is constant supply of natural gas. Where do you see the government in improving the infrastructure needed to guarantee the supply of natural gas? And also, what do you think about?
Where did you get your 4,000 figures? It's been 10 years since we achieved 4,000. We've just managed to creep over 3,000. So that your gap is still. But I think the government has had significant investments to make
that gap. I think what we had in the past is lack of coordinated efforts. The first stage of privatization has gone through, privatization of the distribution companies in Nigeria. Part of the generating companies have, but the infrastructure in terms of converting gas and internal plants to generating is where we had problems, basically driven by the security situation. I believe getting things right in the near term, we are going to have a situation where we have enough capacity to go between 12 to 15,000. That's within the next 1 year, just because we've gotten some of the basic infrastructure right. But when it comes to transmission and the others, we need significant investment of about $2 billion every year. Where will we get that from? So it gets back to a situation where the larger projects as it relates to transformation and the others may be there, but that's over the long term. We still need situations where we have just independent power projects for different areas. If we are going to get to a wider coverage, as it were. Under the gas master plan aligned with the electricity sector, I think we now see some direction. And requires funding is what we get over there faster.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll take this as the last question. Thank you.
Awesome. Yemi again. What do you Number two. What do you think are the major weaknesses in the African capital markets that are preventing foreign companies from opening up operating subsidiaries in Africa? Is it short-term paper, or is it the bond market, as you mentioned earlier?
I think the list is quite long, and I'm not sure which I'd put at the top. The lack of local currency financing for major, at scale, I think is a major issue. The lack of a lot of fixed income, long-term fixed income product, I think is a major issue. The relative, and this is changing, as you know, but the relative shallowness of the equity markets, I think, is a major issue. The fact that you don't have regional exchanges. I mean, that, at the end of the day, you cannot have each 54 African countries having their own exchanges and expect enough liquidity to attract investors. So, I mean, we didn't touch on this at all, but that is a great both challenge and opportunity and it's one that, it's a piece of infrastructure. It's not hard, concrete infrastructure, but it's still infrastructure nonetheless. That's pretty essential to Africa's development, which is the development of capital markets infrastructure in terms of cross-country regulations, in terms of regional exchanges, in terms of longer-term fixed income financing. That's pretty essential, and there are lots and lots of different initiatives that I think have to be brought together to make that happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you. I think we'll wrap up the session now. To our speakers, thank you for your shared insights, very valuable. And to the audience, thanks for engaging and the questions that you brought to enrich the conversation. We have the full day planned ahead for you, which next up is the breakout panel sessions, which will be taking place on the 4th floor, so that's one floor down. They should be starting in about 10 minutes, so which gives us time to exit the room and find the panels that we're most interested in. So thanks again to Ambassador Simon and to Uri and Fata.
It was a lot of fun.